Hi, I'm Bob Houlihan, Missionary Educator, and I'd like to tell you a story about Myanmar, or which you may know as Burma. My wife and I used to go there several times to speak at a pastor's conference. And one year we were at the conference and Myo Chit was our leader, pointed and he said, "Do you see that man back there?" And I said, "Yeah, I see him." He said he used to be a Buddhist monk, and now he's a preacher of the gospel. And I said, "I've got to know the story." He said, "Well, we used to do shortwave broadcasts into Myanmar, and this monk was in Arakan State, very remote, and he listened to the story of Jesus by shortwave, and he was fascinated about Jesus's book and the gospel. So he said, I want to find this guy named Milchit in Myanmar, in Yangon, the capital." So he, obviously being a monk, he could beg along the way. Finally, he came to the city of Yangon and he asked, he says, "Does anyone know where Milchit lives?" And so they pointed him to his house, and so he came over to Brother Milchit's house and knocked on the door, and Milchit went, and of course he's a monk, he's in saffron robes, his head is shaved, and it's obvious who he is. And Milchit said, "Well, what do you want?" He said, "Are you the guy that talks on radio about a God named Jesus?" He says, "Yeah, I'm the one." He said, "Could you tell me some more?" So Milchit invited him into the house, and they sat down and they began talking and about the story of Jesus. Well, of course, Milchit's a busy servant of the Lord, didn't have a lot of time, but after an hour or two, he says, "Well, I've got to leave." And he says, "Well, okay, well, I'll just stay here till you come back." Well, the monk didn't have any place to go, so he was with Brother Milchit and his wife for 2 weeks. And every time Milchit had a chance, he would talk to them about the Lord Jesus Christ. After a couple of weeks, this monk gave his heart to Christ. He says, "Now, what do I do to be a follower of Christ?" He says, "Well, you've got to change your clothes. You got to let your hair grow. You got to look like a regular person." So he said, "Well, can I go to Bible school? I want to know and study the Bible." And he said, "Well, of course." So they let him come to Bible school, and there he began to study the scriptures and the gospels. And after about 6 months of being in the Bible school with the other students, he began to have a burden for his own people. He says, "The people in Arakan State have never heard this. So I want to go home and tell them." And so they laid hands on him and prayed for him and says, "Well, you can go, but sure you come back." So he went to his home state and came to his own home village. And in those areas, the Buddhist council kind of controls everything. And so they saw him and they said, "Well, what happened to you?" He says, "You don't look like a monk anymore." He said, "Let me tell you about Jesus, God, and about Jesus's book, or the Bible." And so they listened and they said, "You're crazy. We've never heard this. You're just flat out crazy." And they said, "No, this is true." But they forbid him to speak to anybody in the village. He couldn't talk with his family members that were there. And he was living in a little hut by himself and just reading the scriptures and praying. He was kind of isolated. At that time, Arakan State was going through a great drought. It was very, very difficult for the farmers. And this monk came across the scriptures. He began to read in 1 Kings, and he came to chapter 18. When it was that Elijah was at Mt Carmel. And if you remember the story, he began to talk to the people about serving only one God, the one true God. So he said, "Let's see which God can send rain." And the monk said, "Well, that's crazy. Are you going to pray and ask God to send rain?" He said, "No, let's see." He said, "If Buddha sends rain, then he's the true God. But if Jesus sends rain, then he's the true God." And the monks, they said, "No, that's not right." But all the farmers said, "Let's try it. Let's see if it works." So they made up a special appointed time. And he said, "Now you monks go first." So they began to pray to Buddha and ask Buddha to send rain. They did all their incantations and everything. And really this single new Christian had really an advantage. because he had the script of the Bible. He knew exactly what God was going to do. After a while praying, they didn't have rain, so they said, okay, now you pray to this Jesus God and see if he sends rain. So he began praying to Jesus. And it was after a little while that God sent rain upon the land. And of course, the people, the farmers began to rejoice. And the monk said, that only happened by chance, or just a coincidence. And so he said, well, let's try it again. So after it stopped raining, they said to the monks, no, you pray to Buddha and see if he can make it rain. Well, it didn't rain. And so he prayed a second time. And God was faithful and sent rain on the land a second time. And all of a sudden, it opened the door to the gospel of Christ in Nautakan State. Now there are scores and scores of churches among those people because of a miracle of God sending rain, just like he did for Elijah centuries ago. God is a God of miracles.